With movies like Avatar, King Kong, Pirates of the Caribbean, or Guardians of the Galaxy, you can clearly see where the money went. But there are also movies where you look at the budget and can't help but wonder, what did they even spend it on? Today, let's try to figure that out using 3 big budget movies as examples. One of these doesn't look impressive, but most of the money really did go into its production. And it shows. With the second one, the money also went into production, yet you couldn't tell even with a magnifying glass. The third is a classic case where the official budget says one thing, but in reality the money never made it to the screen, and ended up spent on yachts and mansions instead. A lot of people probably remember Ridley Scott's Robin Hood, the movie after which Russell Crowe finally stopped being a top-tier star. The budget for Robin Hood was $200 million. That's the same amount they spent on King Kong or Transformers, and significantly more than what went into Edge of Tomorrow or Guardians of the Galaxy. For comparison, Gladiator had a budget of just $100 million, half that. You can only guess what was going through the minds of the people who approved such an enormous budget for a movie like this. But that's not really the point. With Robin Hood, it's pretty clear where the money went. $20 million went to the talented Russell Crowe. The equally talented Ridley Scott took $15 million, Cate Blanchett got another $10 million, so about $45 million went to just those 3 people. And while Robin Hood doesn't look like a $155 million movie either, the rest of the money did go into production. Ridley Scott didn't want to use special effects in the movie because he thought they looked too fake. To make everything feel more authentic, the crew built an entire town of Nottingham with over 50 houses. But Scott didn't stop there. They'd also built an actual French castle with 65-foot-high walls nearby. That's the same castle that only appears on screen for a few minutes at the start of the movie. Interestingly, the budget could have been even higher. Scott really wanted the film to have its own Tower of London, but the studio shut that down. So the tower had to be done with visual effects. If the movie had less expensive actors and the studio had reined in Scott's ambition to build an entire town and a castle, Robin Hood could have easily fit into a $100 million budget, which is exactly what it looks like. But this seems like one of those cases where the studio just had too much faith in the project. The sequel to Bruce Almighty, which turned into a spin-off during production, is probably one of the most surprising projects to actually make it to the big screen. Usually, spin-offs have smaller budgets than the original films. Even something like Hobbs and Shaw, which had obvious box office potential, cost less than the main franchise. Yet somehow, Sony and Universal managed to spend a whopping $175 million on Evan Almighty. For comparison, Bruce Almighty, starring Jim Carrey, cost only $80 million. The only real competition for Evan in this regard is probably Speed 2. Whose budget jumped from $30 million to $160 million, and that was without its main star. But Speed 2 can't really be called a spin-off. Steve Carell got $5 million for his role, and Morgan Freeman got $3 million. Big numbers for sure, but still not enough to justify the film's massive budget. The story of Evan Almighty began in 2004, when Universal paid aspiring screenwriters Bobby Florsheim and Josh Stolberg $2.5 million for a script called The Passion of the Ark. At first, it was meant to be a standalone movie, unrelated to Bruce Almighty. But as development got underway, the studio started to worry it wouldn't make a profit. The tone was too dark. Sony came on board to split the budget in exchange for international distribution rights. But as production neared, Sony started to worry too. Pre-production cost had already passed $15 million, and canceling would have been messy due to studio contracts. After weighing their options, Florsheim and Stolberg rewrote the script to turn The Passion of the Ark into a Bruce Almighty sequel. That's when another problem popped up. After reading the revised script, Jim Carrey backed out, and Jennifer Aniston followed. The process of shutting down The Passion of the Ark, hiring new writers, firing and replacing producers, all of that cost another $10 million. At that point, they'd already spent close to $30 million, and the movie still didn't exist. Both studios were staring down serious financial losses. That's when the idea of a spin-off came up. The script was rewritten yet again, this time for Steve Carell, who had a role in Bruce Almighty and had since become the star after the 40-year-old version. The shifting focus and starting filming didn't save the movie. The studio poured tons of money into caring for the many animals used in the film. On top of that, the extreme heat in Virginia where they were shooting meant the lawn around Carell's character's house had to be constantly replaced because the scorched grass looked awful. Many crew members ended up hospitalized from heat stroke. Filming, which was supposed to take 4 months, ended up taking 7. All of this, combined with the post-production work on special effects, pushed the budget for Evan Almighty to $175 million, making it the most expensive comedy ever made. That $170 million includes $30 million that had almost nothing to do with the final film. The failure was brutal. The movie made just $173 million at the box office, $100 million from American audiences, and the remaining $73 million from international markets. Of course, Sony took the bigger hit, since Universal made $50 million from US sales, while Sony only earned $35 million globally. Both studios also lost millions more on promotion, money they'll never get back. The funniest part? The only thing left from Bobby Florsheim's and Josh Stolberg's original script was the idea of building the Ark. In other words, the writers got paid $2.5 million just for that single idea. Cinema is a business where billions of dollars are on the line. It'd be naive to think everyone in the industry puts creativity first. Naturally, money is what matters most to Hollywood studios. That said, most studios at least try to make money honestly. That doesn't mean they only produce high-art films hoping people will show up. It just means they aim to profit by releasing movies in theaters and later selling them on physical media, streaming platforms, and so on. But it doesn't always work like that. Some studios make their money from the act of making movies, even if they don't actually need those movies. Franchise Pictures' A Sound of Thunder is a prime example of this alternate way of doing business in Hollywood. It's not exactly a clean method, but it's more common than you think. Franchise Pictures acted as a middleman for private investors, hedge funds, and small companies looking to invest in film production. The fact that it wasn't a trustworthy middleman didn't become obvious right away. The company was founded in 1998, and thanks to strong industry connections, it quickly aligned itself with Warner Brothers, one of the big Hollywood studios. Here's how the operation worked. Franchise would take money from investors interested in backing a movie and put it into its own productions. If the film was a hit, everyone made money and went home happy. That did happen once in a while, but more often the company cranked out flops like The Art of War with Wesley Snipes. The budget for The Art of War was comparable to The Matrix, which came out of the same year in 1999. But visually, The Art of War looked way cheaper. The most expensive scene was probably the exploding minivan halfway through the movie, and of course Wesley Snipes himself wasn't exactly cheap. Another dud from the studio was Ballistic: X vs. Sever, starring Antonio Banderas. Its budget was even higher than The Matrix, though anyone who's seen it knows the difference is night and day. Occasionally, the studio struck gold. The Whole Nine Yards is a great example. That movie only cost $40 million to make and had Bruce Willis, who was a major box office draw at the time. It might have even been a kind of advertisement for the studio. Franchise's shady business practices were exposed during the production of Battlefield Earth. One of the film's investors sued the company after discovering that the movie, which was supposed to have a $75 million budget, had actually cost closer to $50 million. That lawsuit opened the floodgates, and more cases of financial mismanagement came to light. At the time, Franchise was working on A Sound of Thunder. Although the official budget was $80 million, only $4 million was spent on special effects. Swamped with lawsuits, the studio filed for bankruptcy, leaving the movie unfinished. With no one left to complete it, the studio handed over all materials to the investors who had already sunk $75 million into what looked like a $20 million production. Hoping to recover something, the investors scraped together another $4 million for extra visual effects. The film finally hit theaters a few years after Franchise collapsed, and brought in only $11 million. Here's the kicker. After nearly a decade of lawsuits, it turned out the bank that had guaranteed Franchise's finances had changed its name and legally became a different entity. As a result, all the lawsuits were dismissed, and there was no one left to sue. Some investors managed to recoup just $9 million, which they spent on legal fees over the years. Something similar is happening now with the company Emmett Furla Oasis, which often featured Bruce Willis in its films. But their budgets are much smaller than Franchise Pictures were. It seems like investors have learned a lesson and are a lot more careful with their money these days. Thanks for watching. Subscribe and stay tuned.